Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight to celebrate the Boys and Girls. We are tremendously grateful for the support of the University of Washington community in making this event possible, and we're so glad to see all of you here tonight. I have a couple of reminders before we get started. First of all, please do take this time to silence your cell phones. Additionally, there will not be a signing taking place after this event, but as you probably saw from the pre-signed stock is available for purchase in the lobby right behind you. Finally, if you have a chance and you haven't yet, we are for this event helping raise money for the ASUW Shell House renovation. It's a fantastic way to show your support for the university and for Boys in the Boat. We have a couple of cash donations in the lobby, and you can also always donate online. Beginning right here in our backyard, the Boys in the Boat has gone on to inspire people across the nation and around the world. Now, as a feature film, the story of Seattle's Boys of 36 is taking on new life and taking the world by storm once more. It is my honor, on that note, to introduce tonight's guests. Moderating our conversation is Eric Cohen. Eric is a former coxswain, 3-time Pac-10 champion, 1981 consensus national champion competing in Henley, and captain at Washington. He joined the Washington Rowing Stewards in 1995, founded the website huskycrew.org in 2001, wrote the 100-year history of Washington rowing in 2003, and with classmates Al Forney and Al Erickson, established the Class of '82 Endowed Scholarship for Men's Rowing in 2012. In 2016, the University of Washington honored Eric with the Dave and Ruth Cohen Award for outstanding service and support of University of Washington athletics. Eric continues today as an active member of the Rowing Stewards and as the historian for the University of Washington rowing team, recently completing the University of Washington women's rowing history in conjunction with the 50th anniversary of Title IX. Daniel James Brown is the author of Facing the Mountain, The Indifferent Stars Above, and Under a Flaming Sky, which was a finalist for the BNN Discover Great Writers Award. And of course, he is the author of The Boys in the Boat, a New York Times best-selling book that was awarded the American Library Association's Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Nonfiction, and which was recently adapted into a feature film by George Clooney. He has taught writing at San Jose State University and Stanford University, and he lives outside Seattle. One more thing for you folks, when it's time for us to go to Q&A, as you see we have 2 mics here. When Q&A begins, if you have a question, please feel free to line up behind the microphones. You will be called on, and we will ask your question. Without further ado, thank you so much for joining us this evening, and please enjoy tonight's event.
So we have these crazy mics, I'm not sure how they work, but we're going to look at them on. Can everybody hear us in the back? Okay.
How about me? Oh.
We have been louder on this. Well, it's wonderful to be here tonight. Wonderful to see around the kids who love being from Seattle. We'd like to ask you, right off the bat, how many people graduated? All right, how many have seen the movie? Cool. Great. Okay, here's the big question. How many have read the book and seen the movie? All right. So we've got the full group. That's great. That's exciting. So we're just gonna have a conversation tonight. We have done this before, mostly during the PBS tour, I think. And for those of you who haven't had a chance to see that, really, I again agree, it's really great. It's only 50 minutes long. It's not a 2-hour movie, but it's a documentary. It really does, to me, really grasps the story of both Joe and the team. Would you agree?
Yeah, well, It goes into a lot of things that the feature film doesn't go into. And it is, because it is a documentary, there's no fictionalization of anything. So I think it's I hope you will see both. I think they go well together, actually. The one complements the other in the sense that the one is entertainment and the other is more informational. So it was a lot of fun working with Eric. We wound up in Los Angeles together, and I wound up down there in Beverly Hills, no less, without a pair of dress shoes to wear to the premiere of that event. And Eric saved me because Eric, it turns out, has the same shoe size. And I had forgotten to bring any shoes, and he brought at least 2 pairs of shoes.
It's about,
for everybody's gift.
that's what coxswain training.
Yeah.
You bring 2 pairs of everything. I want to tell you, when I was a freshman, and I made the team, I made the first freshman team, and the coach came to me with my jersey and all of the jerseys of all my teammates. And I said, well, aren't you just going to give those to the guys? And he said, I don't trust any of those guys, I trust you. Here's my team. Yes, here's my shirts. I want you to know we still call these the Dan Brown shoes. So like my wife will out and I'll say, I get my shoes for the Dan Brown shoes. I know. Okay, so let's start this. I think one of the very first things that we miss in the movie that you captured so well in the book is the young Joe Rance. And I think, without commenting a lot about the movie, let's talk about Joe Rance as a young man. And how did you get the information about Joe? I mean, that's, I think, the first 6, 7 chapters. Yeah, how did you?
You know, I could develop Joe to the extent that I did only because of his daughter, Judy. Judy had spent the last, when I met Joe, he was in the last couple months of his life. And so I tried to spend some time with him while I could. But Judy had spent the last 4, 5, 6 years of her dad's life documenting it, basically, asking him questions, going over old articles with him, taking notes, digging out photographs. So even after Joe passed away, Judy had this encyclopedic knowledge, and she also had boxes of materials about her dad's early life. And so I had begun to develop Joe's backstory as deeply as I did without that help from Judy. And for me, that really was always kind of the engine of the story. I mean, the first time I heard Joe tell the story, I thought it was great. But as I dug into his personal story more, it really, for me, became really the most important part of telling the story. I mean, obviously, going to Berlin, beating the Nazis was the triumph at the end. But the arc that Joe's life took from his very early days, particularly from the time when he was abandoned by his parents out in Square, all the way through the 36th year. And then actually beyond that too, although in the book I can only say a little bit about his later life. But the arc of his life, from that kind of hardship, that kind of deprivation, to finally becoming whole in a sense, becoming part of something larger than himself, that crew really became the family that he didn't have. So to me, that was the heart of the story. And as interesting as the rowing stuff is, and I became fascinated with rowing, that's always been the engine of the story. But yeah, so Judy basically was my major resource.
So she knew the story of him as a 10-year-old, and abandoned, I think when he was 10. Oh, that's when he was going to take him up to the
Cohen
schoolhouse.
Yeah, so they first were in Idaho at several mining camp, and Joe got in trouble there with his stepmother and got thrown out of the house at that point. But it was really when they moved to Squim that he came home from school one day and found the family car all packed up and idling in the driveway. And I had a short conversation with his stepfather, or his father and his stepmother, and off they drove. They left him there, standing in the driveway in Squim. And so, of course, that's the really poignant moment from which the rest of the story sort of flows, because they had not, Joe and his stepmother had not really gotten along very well from the beginning. His stepmother, I should say, his stepmother was not at all good to him, and his father, in my opinion, was very negligent in regards to him. So that culminated in that abandonment.
One of the great things that I'm writing about that part is, like, for me, I could feel myself with the emotion of that, right? There was anger.
Yeah.
You know, like, it was fun. You read it, when you were writing it, did you also feel this anger? Were you like,
Yeah, I should talk to my wife about that. Oh, stepmother.
although there's, and I just say, I have some compassion for you too.
Yeah, actually, and I always like to bring this up. Philip died in the middle of the story. So in 1929 was it? Anyway, she died early, and she isn't here to tell her side of the story. She wasn't there to tell her side of the story. So when I was researching the book, actually went out of my way with Judy's help, to find her kids and interview them. And we asked Harry Jr. especially, why did your stepmom do that? Why did she just turn her back on Joe that way? And I remember Harry Jr. just saying, I don't know, I don't understand, I never understood. So she did what she did. But I do like to remind people that, as I say, she wasn't grounded in either side of the story. I also have some understanding for her because she was an exceptionally good violinist, and she had legitimate ambitions to become a concert violinist. And she wound up swept away by this older man, Joe's father, and found herself living in a mining camp in Idaho in a cabin with dirt coming in through the floorboards and so on and so forth. And then she found herself with 3 kids, and then with a great, huge, strapping adolescent that wasn't her kid. And there were a lot of pressures on her, and her situation was not all that she had anticipated. So I think I try to take that.
Well, I think it also underscores the fact that it wasn't just the depression, that was in the 20s when a lot of that was happening. People were affected by a different time than we live in.
Yeah.
And the gratitude that I know I have for the times that we live in today, it was the key. I mean, and this is.
Yeah, and I should say it wasn't entirely uncommon for families to, if they had a teenage boy especially, to sort of send him off to Uncle Bill or Aunt Polly or somebody, so that where he could work and he'd be one less time.
So I want to read this. And to me, this is just such a part of the development of Joe. But also, as a person who was undergoing to Washington, I can tell you that I wrote with people like this, almost exactly like this, that came from farms and came from parts of Washington that I wasn't familiar with, who had lived a life like this. With a long-handled double-edged axe, he split fence rails from massive cedar logs that washed down the Dungeness in the spring. He dug wells, he built barns, crawling around in the rafters and pounding nails. He hand-cranked cream separators and lugged 120-pound cans of milk and sweet cream around dairy farms, loading them onto trucks for delivery to the Dungeness Slim Farms cream. As summer came on, he labored under pale blue skies in the dry fields surrounding Squim, cutting hay with a scythe, working it on the wagons, and hoisting it by the ton with the wasps.
Yeah. A lot of really tough physical work.
And carry. Like that's not like he did one thing or he did 2 things. It's like he did whatever he got up in the morning and he did whatever he did.
Yeah, he did whatever he had to do to get a meal at the end of the day, including poaching salmon from the Dungeness and foraging for mushrooms in the woods and things like that. So we're talking about basic survival. We're talking about a 14-year-old kid living on his own, just literally trying to survive, and also, actually, kind of importantly, also stay in school. I mean, one of the things I admire about Joe is that while he was living out there in that half-built cabin in Squim, foraging for food, poaching salmon, cutting hay. He was also managing to stay in school at Swim High because he really wanted to get to university. He really had his eyes set on getting here.
Do you know why? Why was that? What was why? And who said it? Was that his brother?
Yeah, so his brother, I think, encouraged him a lot. And he did come to Seattle and move in with his brother for a while, just before he wound up living here. So his brother very much encouraged him. And I think that his brother was the one member of his immediate nuclear family that really had his back, looked out for him.
His dad too, then. It seems to me like even from a young age, his dad talked about college. And even when the very first time when he was 5, he was shipped off to the East Coast.
Yeah.
I think his dad had talked about college.
Yeah, I mean, it was just a value that they had, and so Joe, but I think with Joe just knew there had to be something better, I mean, you're doing that kind of work and just still hardly managing to feed yourself. You know there's a better world out there, and he was smart enough to know that the path to that better world was right here at the University of Washington.
Okay. So I want to take you now back to the genesis of this entire story happening, because there's some magical stuff there that took place with Judy, and some serendipity in the fact that you were neighbors with Judy and she came over to you. How quickly did you say to yourself, I'm writing this book?
Less than 2 hours, I think. And, I'm ordinarily quite picky. I agonize a lot about topics, what I want to write a book about.
Where were you at? Were you in between?
I was finishing up a previous book, and but I knew that this awful time would come when I had to find a new topic. So I was, receptive. But things like that don't fall into your lap every day as a writer. I mean, they just don't. And so I went down and met Joe, and as I say, I was probably there for 2 hours that first meeting because he was weak, he was on oxygen. I didn't want to overextend my invitation. But, just in those 2 hours that he talked to me and told me his sort of backstory and told me about the rowing, with Judy prompting him along the way, I knew right away that was a great story that somebody should tell. And so I just blurted out that day. I said, Joe, can I write a book about your life? And he immediately shook his head. Said, no. No. Looked down at his feet, and my heart just sank like, oh my God. But he said, and he looked up, and he had these tears in his eyes. He had begun to tear up as soon as he started to talk about the other guys he rowed with. And he looked up, and he had the tears at the end, and he said, and sort of croaked out, he said, but you could write a book about the boat. And at first I thought he meant the Husky Clipper, the actual shell. But I very quickly realized it. And that was, of course, the boat being the crew, being all of them together, and what they had gone through, what they had done together, and really what they had become together. The sort of beautiful, perfect thing that a great crew is. So really, that all had transpired in that first meeting with Joe. And so I left there with permission to write a book about the boat, but it had to be about the boat. So that was being about a 4-year process of.
So where'd you start? Okay, so now you made a decision, okay, write this. So where do you go?
Yeah, so it was pretty intimidating. I got home and I thought, oh great, okay, yeah, you don't know anything about rowing. You didn't grow up in Seattle. It's a long list of reasons like this wasn't a good idea.
Everybody should know your dad went to
California.
So we're all reading the real book, and we've seen movies. Cal is the arch rival in Washington, and I've been our arch rival since 1903. So, and that's both on the men's and the women's side. Okay,
so one of the first things I did is I went down to the Congress Shell House and met you and Luke McGee was the freshman coach, Bob Ernst, and sort of started poking around down there and seeing if people here might help me, learn something about rowing. And the one thing I didn't mention was where I went to.
Really smart of you.
Yeah, and I did. You know, the first time I ever said that, it was after the book came out, we had a big do at Cohen and a book talk like this. And finally somebody asked me, where did you go to school? And I said, Cal. And there was this gasp spread across the room. It is what it is. And I have to say, I've become, I moved to Cal, but that game has been really painful. I've become a Dusty fan. University's been tremendous to me, not just as a resource, but just everybody's been so supportive of the book from day one.
So you basically sit down, you talk to Joe, you go home, you're like, I'm gonna write this. Do you then end up in Suselo for the next 2 years of your life?
A good piece of it, actually, yeah. I just go to microfiche readers. They have really crappy little microfiche readers. I was blind using those things. Actually, so I did wind up in Suselo, but that wasn't the first thing I did. I mean, the most important thing I did right away was through Judy, I wanted to connect with the family members of as many of the 9 guys as I could.
Yep.
So the moms and everybody. And to varying degrees, we had success. We were able to contact somebody at least in almost all the families.
When you read Don Hoover's diary, were you like, this is really happening? When did you get to that point where you were like, this was meant to happen?
You know, I think seeing those diaries was one of them. I mean, I thought it was meant to happen, as I say, from day one. But one of the things that was great about researching this book is that often when you take a new topic on and you undertake a multi-year research project to write it, oftentimes they will just sort of peter out and doors will close and it won't turn out to be as good as you thought it was going to be. This was a case where new doors just kept opening all the time. Seeing those guys' diaries was one of the doors that opened up. Oh God, I can actually be in the boat with them here at this moment. Those are just invaluable kinds of resources for a writer. Another door that opened up for me was the first couple months that I was talking to Judy about the story, because I started going down there every few days and batting ideas around and showing her drafts of what I was writing. She could talk about this guy named Pocock who built the boats. I was thinking, what about Pocock? What do I care about the guy that built the boat? You know, I didn't see the relevance of it. And then I don't know, but she kept saying, no, you need to understand who George Pocock was. So I started digging into that, and that was a door that just opened up to this whole
dimension.
Yeah. I mean, there was a whole other dimension to the story exactly that I hadn't known was there, and it turned out to be a really important dimension, a whole new layer to the book. So anyway, yeah, I mean, it was, the process was basically reaching out to family members, collecting materials, trying to learn something about rowing. And then I did, went up in Suselo. The thing about what I did in Suselo was I would go in and I'd look for articles in the PI or the Seattle Times about a particular race in 1935, or whatever. And I'd find those articles and I'd take notes on them. But then I would often spend another hour or two just sort of randomly paging through, Seattle Times from 1935. Get a feel for Seattle, because I wasn't around in the 30s and I wasn't in Seattle certainly, so I just wanted to get a feel for what Seattle was like.
Yeah, and what the time. So a large part of the story is, of course, the fact that it takes place during the Depression. When we first started researching the Depression, also what was happening in Germany.
Yeah.
Right? And there were multiple global events taking place that were going to influence the world forever.
Yeah.
When you started to tie those parts of it into it as well, were you feeling like, okay, this is part of the story? Was there ever a part of it that was like, I'm not sure I want to tell that part?
Yeah. I mean, I was really nervous about how to construct it because I did come to the point where I thought it was really important, because while I was telling Jack to Joe's backstory, I wanted to talk about what was going on in Germany at the same time. But how do you do that without just interrupting the flow of the story so completely that people just throw up their hands? And I mean, frankly, it does a little bit. I forget what chapter you're reading along, and then all of a sudden they take you off to Germany. And for some readers, that's a bit of a jump. But I really felt that I needed to do that. I wanted to put the story of what was going on with this kid and his crewmates into a context of what was happening in the world. And his backstory told us the Depression story, but the only thing that was going to tell the Germany part of the story was picking readers up and transporting them to Germany. And so I decided to do that. And to tell you the truth, I went a little off the rails with that in the first draft. I became obsessed with the Nazis' effort to use the gays as propaganda. And I became particularly obsessed with Joseph Goebbels and his very cynical, he was the minister of propaganda for the Nazi party. I became obsessed with the evil of Joseph Goebbels. And I wrote in that first draft probably 40 pages more about Goebbels. Yeah.
But I found all of it fascinating.
I did too, but my editor found the last book. That's fascinating.
Yeah. Okay, let me read this. But what's your current take on that? So for those of you, I think most of us know that Leni Riefenstahl did a huge propaganda movie on the 1936 Olympics. You can still go see it. It's called it's exceptional, it's incredible, but it's pure propaganda. And it was done through the funding of the Nazi Party. What's your take on it?
So she's a really interesting character. I mean, I was actually talking to George Clooney about this not too long ago, and she said, I was talking about the great filmmaker she was, and he said, yeah, but she was an effing Nazi. Yeah. Which is true. I mean, she was. She tried to distance herself from the Nazi Party later in life. She was a very good filmmaker. She was precocious, I would say, particularly for a female filmmaker. She ran her own studio, and in the early 1930s, that was a very unusual thing that a female studio had. And if you look at, for instance, the gold medal rowing sequence that the book culminates in, it's a great piece of film. I mean, the pulled back shots she shot all that day, and it's very dramatic. You're seeing the boats go down the course. But then she got the Americans and the Germans and the Italians to row again the next day. And she put cameras right in the boat. And she put them right in the face of the coxswains.
She took the coxswain out. She took the coxswain out, put a camera in at Don Hume.
Right.
Don Hume out, put the camera where Don Hume was, and did bomb him.
Did bomb up, exactly. And then so what she did was, as the film progresses, she cuts those close-ups in more and more and more frequently. And so you get a sense of the pace of the
She also speeds up the film. She also speeds up the film. And I think that's, that's part of where this, I was just at the end chorus doing a show for them with the movie. And one of the audience people who had read the book said, did they really take it up from 46 at the end of that race? And I said, no. And yet we're told that they did. And I think that may have something to do with the fact that she sped up. If you take a stroke rate off of that, it may go up to 46. But they did not take it to 46. But anyway, yes, there was a lot of editing she did there too. But it's incredible. And we have it.
We have it. And I mean, it was, one of the most valuable things I could have was actual footage of the climactic race. I tried to find, you couldn't find newsreel footage of some of the dual races here.
So when Margaret did her documentary PBS, did you see a lot of footage that you hadn't seen?
Absolutely, yeah. That's one reason the PBS documentary is so worth watching, is that they did an amazing job.
Incredible. And there was serendipity in that one too, because that was when they found the can of film marked Berlin in Al Ulrichson's family's attic.
Right.
And it was George Pocock's actual film from the silent black and white of them training Berlin.
And they did amazing wizardry with it. They stabilized it somehow, so that you talk about old film that ordinarily would be all flickery, and they stabilized it, and it looks almost like it was shot on video. It's it's
But
remarkable.
that also has the trials win with Bob Monk standing up at the Cox and see how they win.
Yes.
You know, it's just.
Wish that was in the movie.
Yeah, okay, so there's so much to talk about here. It's such a wonderful book. I wanted to talk about Vancouver.
Sure.
So I think it was the summer of 35. Summer of 35, Joe goes to Vancouver and works with Vancouver Day. And he's basically strung up on the side of the cliff with jackhammer mixing. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay. So, in point of fact, though, as Joe would soon find out, there was no place that Chuck Day was more likely to be that summer than at Vancouver. So he meets Chuck Day there. To understand him, you had to understand his heart. They're talking about Chuck Day. He was a ferocious competitor. If you put a challenge in front of him, he attacked it like a bulldog, and he just plain didn't know the meaning of surrender. If a river needed to be dammed, then by God, just get out of the way and let it be. That's Chuck Day.
That's Chuck Day.
Okay, so now that's what's so incredible about this particular crew team is that Dan wrote a story about Joe Rance, and yet talk a little bit about what you know about some of those other men. I'll talk about Ron Monk.
Yeah. I mean, I know varying amounts about the guys, and that was sort of an issue for me when I was writing, because I actually had a hard time finding Don stuff in particular. But, they were all, I mean, what interests me, I think, is sort of the common core that they all had. They all more or less have hard-scrabble backgrounds, except for Chuck Day.
Except he went to good.
Yeah, he did go to Cohen.
The interesting thing is that Johnny White was the same way. Johnny White really didn't have to, his dad was like, no, you're going to go work.
Right. And, and that's part of the thing is that they all felt the sting of the Depression. Nobody felt it, I think, on that crew quite the way that Joe did. Although Roger Morris, I think, his family had a really hard time too. But the experience of dealing with the simple necessities of life, and then on top of that, having the ambition to go to university, that was a kind of challenge that they faced. And then you add to that going off the crew and going out for a gold medal when you're on the crew. These were guys that were up for challenges. And they were up for challenges partly out of necessity, as they had to survive. But it also, I think, became part of their DNA, and I think it served them well in the rest of their life. And that's one thing I'd say about rowing as a sport. I've met thousands of rowers over the last few years, and you know better than I do, Eric. But I think the sport does develop a certain kind of character. I don't know if it attracts a certain kind of character, or it develops the character, or it's both. Yeah. But there is I can almost see rowers coming from a distance. I mean, what they're tall, way taller than people.
So a little bit.
Yeah. I'm constantly size guys. I don't know, there's just this sort of, I hesitate to put it into words because it would be inadequate, but there's this sort of combination of tenacity and drive that somehow harmonizes with an ability to harmonize with other people, get along with other people, pull for the other people in the boat as much as for yourself, if not more. There's a kind of character. And one of the things I've noticed, frankly, about rowers is a lot of the rowers I've met have been just very successful people in life. I mean, I think it is maybe it's a truism, but I think that it is true, that it's a sport that attracts and develops the kind of character that makes people successful.
Toughness, determination,
sure.
adaptability.
Absolutely.
There are so many of these adjectives we can use to describe the men and women that are attracted to this sport or become good at this sport. They kind of have these characteristics of people that never, ever quit.
Yeah.
They just don't quit. You talked about shared sacrifice, and I saw you in one of your talks. You were talking about shared sacrifice and how it's a brutal sport. It's a brutal sport. And trust me when I say that. I was a Cox, and it was a brutal sport. So you're out there and you're rowing on a January day like today. Can you imagine being out there today? Right? They would have been out there today. In the wind and in the rain and in the cold, and it would have been dark in the morning, and they were out there. So, and when I say that, I want you to know I'm talking about both our men's and our women's team. And it is a character builder. But here's the best part, is you're doing it with a teammate that you can reach out and touch. And you're mirroring what they do. You're doing the exact same thing they're doing, except you're doing it on the other side of the play. And so every single stroke you're doing that, and every single stroke you're working towards that synchronicity. You're working towards that swing, finding that swing. And when you find that, and you know, you found it. You found what your purpose was in the sport. It's an incredible feeling.
Yeah.
So when you talk to Joe, how did you get this idea of swing? What was as an author who didn't know anything about rowing, how did you come to understand what that meant?
Yeah, well, I mean, this became conspicuous when I was both reading about it and also talking to rowers. People started using this term, and I just, as a writer, I got curious, what does this mean? Because it seems to be important to these people. And so, basically, I've never been in a boat able to feel the swing, so I had to, again, just try to become a very good listener. And I did through Judy, through people at Cohen, through other sources I had back east, I was able to talk to a lot of really high-level oarsmen and oarswomen. And they would talk about swing, and they would get this sort of misty look in their eyes. And I just knew that it was something really special, something rare, something we strove for. And I hope that the description of it in the book does justice to it, because, as I say, as a writer, I try to experience as much as I can about what I'm writing about, but I'm translating here, okay? I'm taking an experience that other people have felt and trying to describe it. And I hope I got it right.
Well, I asked you that, he's doing an exceptional job. Okay, I'm gonna read here. This actually is a part that's close to my heart, because this was actually from an interview that I did with Bob. I got to talk about Mach multiple times when I was researching for the history of Washington. I went in 2003, and Bob was still around, and Bob was very much with it. Every part of his personality that he was like when he was a coxswain was what he was like when he was 84, 85, and stuff. But this is him describing when they were at the IRAs, the national championships in 1936 on the Hudson, and they were coming back the night before. They were going to row the final of the national championship. They went so far ahead they could not even hear the boys in the boats. This is at night on the river, and they had been out with practice with all the other crews. And then one by one they realized that they couldn't hear anything at all except for the gentle murmur of their blades hitting into and out of the water. They were rowing in utter darkness now. They were alone together in a realm of silence and darkness. Years later, as old men, they all remembered the moment. Bobby Mock recalled, you couldn't hear anything except for the oars going in the water. It'd be a zep, and that's all you could hear. The oarlocks didn't even rattle on the release. They were rowing perfectly, fluidly, mindlessly. They were rowing as if on another plane, as if in a black void among the stars, just as Pocock had said they might. It was beautiful. That's real good writing.
That's from your interview with Bob, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I definitely want to stop here and say that one of the principal resources and advantages that I had in writing this book is that Eric has been compiling the history of Washington rowing, both men and now women, for I don't know how many years, 20 years now. And he has, in fact, compiled the exhaustive, comprehensive history of both the men and women's program. And it's just this amazing resource. And so I was aware of that as I was trying to find the source.
Yeah, well, thank you, but it also, I wasn't able to put it in context like that when you were. And I think that it's important for the reader, and I think it's part of the reason why this book has been so popular, is because you've been able to take these parts of Joe's life, but then also translate it into his experience among the rowing team itself. That brought it into what we were just talking about, these multiple dimensions. All right, so let's talk about the George Pocock dimension, because I think that's just such a critical part of the story. You know, I mean, I know a number of these quotes now off the top of my head, and they're incredible. The way he understood life, right? You know, harmony, balance, rhythm. Talk about that. So when you first started to read about George Pocock, and you just told us that you did, tell us more about how you were like, whoa, okay, here we go.
Yeah, I mean, it just became apparent over a relatively short period of time, I guess, a few months, as I was digging into Pocock, reading his own writing, reading about him.
There's a whole book he wrote. He actually, I guess somebody else wrote the book. They took his memoirs and published in a book called Ready All.
Right, and then Stan gave me access to George's actual writing. So, and that was kind of a big moment. It dawned on me, this guy is really, I mean, he has, first of all, he has a way with words, but also he just is thinking about things on a really deep level. And that comes into play particularly when he's writing and talking about his craft of building boats. Because to him it was almost a religious experience. I mean, crafting these boats as perfectly as he could, getting them, every single millimeter of them as perfect as he could. It was almost a spiritual endeavor to him.
I would say it was a spiritual
endeavor. And the thing is, and then he talked to the kids about rowing in the same kinds of terms, because he had learned this. He had learned that he could elevate his life by exercising his craft as well as he could, and then trying to exercise it even better. And he taught these kids, not just Joe, but whole generations, I think, of rowers at Washington, that they were engaged in a craft too, and that they should think of what they were doing as something more than just trying to muscle the boat across the line. There was an art to it. There was harmony, balance, and rhythm. There was, and in doing that, they were lifting themselves up, again, on a spiritual, in a spiritual way.
Right, and so he called it a symphony of motion. One of his famous quotes is, rowing, when you're rowing well, you're reaching perfection. And when you reach perfection, you're touching the divine. It touches the you of yous, which is your soul.
Yeah.
And so that goes to this spiritual aspect that he had, or context that he had, I think, in almost everything he did. And still, if you come down Conacher Shell House, which is the shell house that the young men and women row out today, you will see Conacher quotes, or Pocock quotes, throughout the building, because he still remains a spiritual core of, and the values that Washington.
You know, I should also want to credit Judy for this. Every chapter in the book starts off with a quote from Pocock. That was her idea. And I resisted it at first because it wasn't familiar to me. I'm used to seeing a different, you know, when you see quotes from writers at the beginning of the chapter, usually it's different writers. And I thought, I really want to do this, have the quotes from the same guy over and over and over. But actually, I think it was brilliant because I think the effect of it, I hope, was that because every chapter starts with a little bit of Pocock, you get this feeling that Pocock's spirit is just sort of hanging over the story. And that's the way it was for these guys.
That's absolutely right. And you know, if you can, I don't know how many of you have been able to go down to the SUW Shell House and take a tour. If you ever get a chance to do that, you should do that. It's not going to be available because they're going to rebuild it. And by the way, we're here to help fundraise for that. And so if you have an opportunity, please help that out, because it is it's going to be alive now for forever. And the upstairs where Pocock's shop was is going to be completely redone, refurbished, and made into his shop. Nicole calls it the heartbeat of the building. Nicole's been the person behind, the driver behind getting this thing redone. It is going to be an incredible place for not just the university, but for the students themselves. It's actually being run by the student center is the idea behind it. But can you imagine as a student being able to come down there and get a sense of these young men that were there 100 years before you were?
I'm hoping actually one of the things they'll do to that building is just run every incoming freshman through the building. sit them down and we'll talk about the history of Washington and Washington.
Well, and there's more to that too, because it can, before the cut was made, this was for the indigenous people here, this was a critical place that we call carrying canoe. And so this has been a part of the history of the region forever and ever and ever. One of the things Dan and I talked about before coming out here is we did want to kind of make this as Seattle-centric as we could, because with the Seattle audience here, we don't necessarily always get to do that. And the Seattle community, you have been a huge part of this story. And I don't mean just the boys in the boat, but I mean Washington Road. We have the Winter Cup every year, and we have tens of thousands of Seattleites come to that, even when it's cold and dark and wet, you still come out for that. And we feel your support, and we feel your heart, and we feel the community that's been with this team from the very get-go. I want to quickly read here, because this is an important part that kind of gets washed over in the movie. This is about the Seattle community coming together to raise $5,000 for the team in 48 hours. A few hours later, Seattleites woke to alarming headlines and radio news bulletins. The entire town went to work. Cohen's on summer break grabbed tin cans and began going door to door in their neighborhoods. Paul Coughlin, president of the Alumni Association, started placing calls to some of the university's more prominent graduates. Thousands of lapel pins and tags were quickly printed out, and students on campus for summer session began to sell them for 50 cents a piece in the hallways. Radio announcers broke into their morning programming to appeal for funds. Downtown IFEs, the general manager of Pacific Telephone and Telegraph, signed on as chairman of the campaign, and et cetera, et cetera. And this community came together and raised the $5,000 to send those young men to Berkeley in 48.
Yeah, which I mean, one of my favorite parts of the story. And again, it was one of those doors that opened up when I discovered that. Going to the Times and going to the PI and reading about the actual unfolding, I was like, wow.
Yeah, so thank you, Steve.
Yeah.
Okay, so should we start doing questions?
Sure.
Okay, so we would be happy to take questions from the audience if you want to come up to the microphone, or if you want to use my microphone. This is actually my microphone. So this is actually a microphone. I was right in the transitionary period from when we went from the Bob Mock microphone to the microphone that we were here. So there's actually tape marks here. You see the tape where I would take the wire that went in for the microphone and send it here. But I had done it in high school, and I was still old school and stubborn enough that I wanted to wear a megaphone. Plus I could yell at cow a lot. They couldn't hear my microphone, but they could hear that. All right, so come on up for any questions. Come on up.
So thank you both for everything that you've done for the Seattle community. I'm curious what your top three on the cutting room floor of the book. You made reference to some of the Nazi history, but any other anecdotes or anything to share that the reader hasn't heard?
Actually, only one thing, and my wife will attest to this if anyone still bothers her. That day when the family, Joe came home and found the family car all packed up, and they got in the car and they drove away, and they got Joe standing there. Joe's little brother, half-brother, actually was peering out the back window, and Joe could see him that he was mouthing, "But what about Joe? What about Joe?" as the car went down the driveway. And
that's actually she got it.
yeah, I think I can talk to her about it. It's not in the book because I adore my editor, by the way, wonderful editor. But for some reason, she thought that was just too schmaltzy or something. The thing is, it was true. I mean, I got this from Harry Jr. and Sock, totally, that's what he was saying.
It's like a perfect movie.
It is.
Can you imagine the rain coming down and you can barely see the face? It's amazing.
Anyway, it's not there, it's in my head. Sure.
Did they grow again after 1936? As a career?
Yeah, Eric will tell you all about this in detail. I will tell you that in 37, they wrote all together except for Bob Mock, I think, who was off to Harvard at that point.
But anyways,
MIT.
Hold on. Actually, he graduated and became coach at Washington for 3 years and then,
Oh, really?
yes, and went to Harvard as a law student.
Was he in the boat in 37?
No, I said he was coaching. You were right there. He was coaching in 37. Okay, so let me just quickly tell you, all 8 of the rowers in that team came back in 1937. And if you were Cal, that was incredibly depressing. Like those guys, if you thought they were dominant in 1936, they were more dominant in 1937. And that's across the board, that entire team. So we swept the IRAs in 1936, and that was the first time in the history of the sport any team had ever swept. Sweeping means you win every event. So there were 3 events, the freshman 8, the JV 8, and the varsity 8. We won all of those in 1936. In 1937, we turned around and did it again, but with even larger margins. The junior varsity shell in 1937 couldn't beat any varsity team on that river. That's how good that team was. And here you go. You want to jump that to modern history? Our 2012, our 2013, and our 2015 team, men's side, swept the IRAs, and there were 5 events. Okay, that's how good we are now. Our women's team in 2017 and 2019 swept the NC2As. That is the only time in the history of women's rowing, except for 1987, before it was an NC2A sport, when the women swept the national championships. Our women, Washington. 2017 and 2019, they swept the NC2As. No one has ever been able to do that before or since. That's how remarkable the teams are that you support today. Okay, we still have. Yes, in 1937 they were unbelievably dominant. And then they got together and they would row together like all of us tried to do. We were union rows. I was actually in one 2 years ago for our 40th. Yes, we do get together, and those guys did, and they rowed together through 96. I want to say, yeah, they were together in 1996. So 60 years later, they were still out rowing. We got some stuff. Yeah,
Mr. Brown, I'm not a rower, but I love the book. I've seen the movie twice already. And on the first viewing, I just got caught up in the story again. But on the second viewing, I noticed what I kind of already knew, which was that it wasn't shot here. But what I'm really wondering about, because you didn't write the screenplay and just sold the rights, were there any liberties taken with the book that didn't sort of actually really happen that was added for dramatic effect? Like for instance, the one that I thought might not have happened was the scene on the train where after calling him Hobo Joe, he comes to apologize. And do you know if that really happened?
That happened. They had a scuffle on the train, actually.
Oh.
Yeah, there are a number of things that were fictionalized in the film. I'm just going to give you my sort of general stand back view of the film. Sure. I mean, I like it, basically. It is, if I had an unlimited budget and I was a filmmaker and I could make a 3-hour film, I think I'd make a film that's quite different. I think I would include Joe's backstory to a much larger extent so that the viewers can see the context. But I think given what I understand to be their budget and the reality of trying to keep it in a 2-hour time frame, I think the trade-offs they made were reasonable. I found it to be a sweet, uplifting, fun film. I came out of the theater, actually the first time I saw it, Mr. Clooney invited Sharon and me down to LA and gave us a screening of it. And I liked it then. I liked it actually even more the second time. The first time I was frankly, wondering why didn't they leave this in, why did they change that? The second time I was sort of past that, I sat back and I just sort of watched it as a movie. And actually, I found myself sniffling and tearing up, and my wife was tearing up, and so it works on that level, I think. So yeah, I'll give you one thing they fictionalized. Cal did not write them a check.
Yeah, I think I'll weigh in here a little too. So I have to agree with the end, and that same time, I saw it was way better. I agree with you. But from a historian standpoint, I'm the accidental historian. I never set out to become a historian. Now I know so much now about so many of these teams and the personalities of their people. It was tough to see some stuff in that movie that really is fictionalized. Reality is, it is a hit. It is a hit. It is a hit today. It is going to be a hit. And people really like this movie. It's doing substantially better than what they said what their original goals were. So people like it.
Yeah, it's been interesting. The reviews have been really mixed, but the audience scores have been off the charts. And so that's sort of what I'm talking about. I think you can definitely pick it apart if you want to. But the holistic view of people going in and watching it, they come out of the theater feeling good, feeling lifted up, being excited about growing. And so for me, that's sort of like
Positive, optimistic.
yeah. So for me, that's where I come down.
Yeah, there's a former copy of the
She says,
GC.
it says there's growing on it, man.
And I have to say thank you very much for the awesome work you did. And you just answered my question about the galaxy.
I do want to say that the college coach, did, and I don't remember if it was before or after the trials at Princeton, but he said he went to Albrechtsen and he said, Washington is the team that you go to Berlin. They are the best team out there. So Hebright was in fact extremely gracious at the end. Yeah.
I want to add, I do want to add, Hebright was a coxswain. So the movie characterization of this larger man as the coach is not accurate. and I want to add even more. Hebright was a Washington coxswain under Hiram Conner. So he came from Washington. He wanted to be a Washington coach, and because Cal was in a place in 1920 where they were about to lose their program, we actually asked him to go down to Cal to coach them, and the rest is history. For those of you who don't know, Hebright coached Cal to the 1928 Olympic gold medal, the 1932 Olympic gold medal, and the 1948 Olympic.
3 straight gold medals.
Okay.
So it's wonderful to hear you describe this. I'm a professor at the University of Washington, across the street here, and I teach in the law school. And I'm holding 2 well-plumbed books, as you can see. So this one I've been teaching a little bit longer than the other, and it's a collection of moral philosophy. So it's Aristotle, it's Kant, it's Bentham, it's it goes on, modern philosophers. And so I teach a course called Jurisprudence and Moral Philosophy. And I always felt that translating those ideas into meaningful action and decisions and making students be able to understand, that these are real life stories can be difficult. They can just be pages in the book. And then your book came out. So for the past several years since it came out, these have been like, a good wine. and it's amazing how well they dovetail. There's a little bit of an accident. We go from cover to cover at the same time. So there's a sort of a matched chapter of each that goes together. And so, for example, as it happens when Joe Rance is living in Swim, for example, and having to survive on his own, we're reading this stuff about the state of nature, and it's perfect. Or another time, the Depression, for example, and do utilitarian ideas, are they the best? Or even John Locke and what is property? Well, is it really Joe's property when he steals that salmon? If he has to survive, for example, or they divert the irrigation stream, that's what makes the water wheel go round. So anyway, my question, really, first of all, thank you for you and my students. We do this every year, and then I do bring them to the Windermere Cup and all these things, right? But did you ever imagine that your book might be used in such ways?
I can't say that I did. Thank you.
you got so deep into the feeling of what it actually feels like to row in a boat. Because as somebody who at grade school has to like read things, but then try to interpret them in your own way so as to not copy the other person, how is it possible that I'm assuming that you've never rowed in a boat, correct?
You couldn't call it rowing, no.
I'm assuming as somebody who's never rowed in a boat, how is it so possible that you can get so deep into the feeling of what it actually feels like to row in a boat with 8 other people?
It's a great question. It's one I've been asked for 10 years now, and I still don't honestly know how to answer it very well. I think I'm good at empathy. I spent a lot of time trying to talk to rowers, particularly, I mean, one thing is that I wanted to learn just the techniques, what's the right thing to do in the boat. But I spent a lot of time talking to rowers about, well, what's it like to row on a river when the current's against you? Or what's it like to row in choppy water in the fog versus on a placid lake? What's it like to row when it's pouring down in a rainstorm? Trying to understand the experience of it, I mean the physical feeling of it, like, how do I explain this? When I write anything, I try to make it very sensory. I try to appeal to the ear, the nose, the sense of touch, as well as sight. So I'm always, when I'm listening to somebody talk about their experience rowing, I'm listening for every little detail I can about the physical experience of being in a boat. And then I just kind of pick that up and put it on.
How many years did you spend doing it?
Well, I worked on the book for 4 years, and so I was doing lots of stuff simultaneously. So I can't really, I don't know how to quantify it, but
It was years.
it was years, yeah. So it's a lot of listening, I think.
And then I had a second question. So how are you able to find all of the little niche moments in the book that you don't think people would think to write down? Like in a journal, I know I have one, is I don't write every single thing that goes on in my life in a journal, but some of the things that are expressed in the book and the movie are moments that like even the most dedicated journalist probably wouldn't think to write down on their page lives. Where did you find all of those little moments that were so unique?
A lot of those come from, the book's completely based on first-hand accounts. So especially Jo Rance's notes, or Judy's notes from her conversations with her dad. So all of that was very meticulous. Like Judy would ask her dad when he was still alive, the day your parents abandoned, your stepmother and father abandoned you out in Squim, what was in the refrigerator? What did you eat? And Joe said, oh yeah, there was some bologna and some stale milk. And so there were little tiny details like that that she managed to preserve for me. So that helped a lot. And then the other thing is it's my habit as a writer, after I get sort of the main story out in big chunks, I always go back and I do what I call micro research. And that is, I go to try to find the little telling details that make a story come to life. So for instance, if I'm writing a scene about guys rowing on the lake at night and finding their swing, well, I'm gonna find out that night in wherever they were, let's say it's Poughkeepsie, on July 12th in 1936, what time did the moon come up? At what phase was the moon in? Because you can find all that at the Naval Observatory website. What was the weather like that day? Was there a wind? Was it perfectly calm? What were the ambient temperatures that day? So once I know what a scene is, I go back to that scene and I try to find every conceivable little, not all the information, but everything that would be helpful to a viewer to feel it and see it when they read it. So a lot of that.
And then one last question. It's about a scene in the movie. I don't know if you know as much about the movie as you do about the book. But there's a scene in the movie when they're about to walk out, when they're in Berlin, and he turns around to Jesse Owens and he says, "Are you ready to prove all of these people wrong?" And he says, "No, I'm ready to prove all the people back home wrong." Do you know if that was actually a thing he said, or if that was just something they did at a movie?
I don't really think about that.
Thank you.
Also, there was no photo finish. Okay, there was no photo. And so the two main questions we get are about $300 and the photo finish. And I've said this multiple times, and I have written this. If it had been close enough for it to be a photo finish, the Americans would not have won. We know that from just the fact that we were in lane 6 and should have been in lane 1. And the way the whole start went down, the fact that this guy walks out of this deal, looks straight down at Germany and Italy, waves the flag and says, "That's a great partay." If it had been a photo finish, America would not have won. So there was no photo finish. We won that by about 10 feet, and that was, I think you said it in the book, it was just enough for it to be no question.
Yeah, I think so.
Thank you.
First of all, thank you both. I've seen the movie 3 times.
Nice.
And it always turns out the same, and I still yell. But I want to give another thought of describing the swing, just for others to understand it. If we had a hard time understanding it ourselves.
Can you stand a little closer to the mic?
Yes.
Yeah.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. I rode for 3 years, and then my senior year, I coached the freshmen. So I had a sense of what they liked and what it was like for me to be part of the group. But for swing, we felt that we were riding higher in the water. The water wasn't giving us as much resistance as it was. We referred to it as flying. It was so much easier. We were higher in the water. And it was, well, you know.
He described that. He actually said that. You said this why.
Yeah.
Johnny White.
Yeah, again, I think it was a time, yeah, so I was exactly taking that description from one of the 36 rowers, that they felt as if the boat was lifting out of the water.
And it doesn't happen very often.
Yeah.
That's another.
That's clear.
But I do have one question. Where did you get the rowers in the movie? The actors, where did they come from so that it looked as if they knew how to row?
So something that point I want to make is that I didn't have anything to do with that. But I do know that they put the actors through a pretty rigorous course of rowing. They had, do you know who the Olympic coach was they worked with? They worked with an Olympic coach.
I mean, I know they did.
I don't remember his name either. So they put the actors through, I've heard several different numbers, I don't know if it was months or weeks, but it was over the course of several months. They put those guys as actors in boats, and I saw pictures of the palaces on their hands. They did serious rowing. And so they got to the point where they could row for a few moments at least. And that's all you need if you're making a film. Row well. And I think I appreciate the fact that they did that. I think they put a lot of effort into getting the rowing as right as you could expect a bunch of actors.
He actually delayed the film, filming them, because Cohen came in, saw them rowing and said, "Dad."
Oh, yeah.
And he said, "That's crap."
Yeah, he did. He wanted to came down from the head to it. Anyway, he saw them and he thought the project was over. I was going to have to kill the film. Because he watched these guys in the boat, their oars were just flying. So he and Grant Hislop was producing part of the so what do we do? Maybe we should make the film. And so there was a whole existential thing. And that's where they hooked them up with the Olympic rowing coach. And they really started bearing down on them. And you know what's interesting, I was actually talking to some of the actors at the premiere in Los Angeles, and I don't want to go too far with this, but they pretty much bonded in the several weeks that they were rowing together. At least 3 of them came up to me and said, you know, at the end there, I think we were like so connected, it was really special
It's
for
something
me.
I'll never forget.
Yeah, this is, they'll never forget it. And so even in the course of just those few weeks, there were a bunch of actors rowing. They started to feel that cohesion and that crew feels, which I thought was really great.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, I've had the privilege of working with the rowers and covering the Wind in Your Cup on many occasions. I was wondering if you would address the fact that in this community, there is a core group of Olympians who live here. I've had the opportunity to meet them, to exactly, interview them, and perhaps educate the audience about what to look for in the Paris Olympics.
Okay, thank you, great question. Well, first thing is MOHI, Museum of History and Industry, which I think you all know, has an exhibit currently, really great exhibit.
I've only seen pictures of it.
Okay, I mean, they actually have a like 1950s era film, boat, cedar pocock shell hanging in there, and it's 8. It's an 8, so it's, I mean, just that alone is an amazing deal, right? But then they also have a number of the Olympians and their medals. It's really worth going down and seeing, because you do kind of start to get the flavor of the number of Olympians that have come out of the Northwest. What happened with the 36 team really started, that was really our beginning of the Olympic movement. But if you go down to Congress Shell House and you look on the wall, there's a plaque there, a large plaque that is dedicated to all the Olympians that have come through the program. Now we have them internationally, of course, we have Olympians that rode at Washington who then win medals for other countries. But if you go and look at that, you will see that there's men and women. And I will tell you, your 2024 question regarding Paris, coming up here this summer, there will be Huskies in the Olympics in Rome. The degree to which we don't know yet, because they haven't made those selections, because these are almost all camp boats now. But the reality is that Washington always has a fairly large contingent of athletes that make it onto the Olympic team, whether that's for the United States or other. Simon Van Dorp, will just give you one example. Simon Van Dorp was in our varsity 8, is from the Netherlands. He won the silver medal in the World Championships last year in the single event. That is the 8 is a huge event, but when you're looking at an iconic event in the Olympics, the single is oftentimes looked at as the most. He won a silver medalist, and he is one of the 3 favorites to win the gold medal at the Olympics next year. He rowed at Washington for 4 years. He's one of the best rowers that have come through here in the last 10 years. He's exceptional. So yeah, to your question, both men and women, and we've had, I can just go back to the 1984 Olympics. That was coached by our coach. We had 3 athletes in there in our women's 8 that won the gold medal in LA, and it has just gone on and on and on throughout the years. So our coach, our current, both our coaches, Michael was the spare from the 2004 team, I think, that won the gold medal, and Yaz was a 2-time Olympian. So just across the board, they're constantly teaching these values that yes, you can do it. We have one of our famous ones, Anne Michelson. I don't know if you met her, but she was a walk-on. Yeah, she's just like Joanna. She was a walk-on here, ended up winning a silver medal in the 2004 Olympics.
I would just add that there may be a few bears in Paris.
That is true. I'll tell you what, Washington makes Cal better, and Cal makes Washington better. And that's the way it's been for decades, for 100 years. Like the reason why we dominated the IRAs in the 20s and the 30s, if you go back and look at the results, it's Cal, it's Washington, it's Cal, it's Washington, it's Cal, it's Washington. Imagine what that made the East Coast feel like. And the East Coast still to this day, you might go on the message boards and you'll read it and they'll be talking trash. Like all year long. And you know who wins the IRAs? Cal. And then they just go quiet. When they start talking trash.
Hello, I'm kind of nervous to ask a question, but this is one of the book is touch beyond the generation. You wrote the youth version of the book as well, which I both not read, but to listen to your voice, and there was tremendous messages in there, so that you saw the audience and book signing, and the grandma in, the granddaughter comes and stuff. I kind of regret I didn't bring my daughter, my teenage daughter, they're busy their activity, couldn't make it to. But beyond that language even, I listened to the English, and my first language is Japanese, but I was really touched. And then your way to describe it, the living in this area, it's very, very beautiful. And then living here for 20 years, and just felt like, oh, I want to bring my friends from Japan to really experience this, hoping that the movie really carries around to the mission so that they can really see more people moving into this area, I'm sure. My question is that being an author, and then this tremendous history of the Osman and plus of that time of the era, historically. What do you achieve the best being an author who couldn't able to achieve? So, for example, with this historical, event, I realized that, wow, I didn't know about this. And then you find out about that accident, but yet that, any other author may have a chance to be writing this book.
Sure.
But what is the most to be remembered other author, what you achieved by writing this book, which other author couldn't do the same topic?
Well, thank you. I'm not sure other authors can do it, and it's very kind of you to say so. But I mean, I think the thing that gives me the most pleasure about having written the book, I mean, there's so many things. But one of them is just every now and then I get an email from somebody who says that they just read the book to their father who's in hospice care and is going to pass away, or their daughter gave them the book because she likes to row and she wants her parents to understand what rowing is like. When you're writing the book, you're sitting in your office, or in my case, sitting on the sofa surrounded by stuff. You forget sometimes that there are people, if the book finds an audience, that actually touches people's lives in ways you can't really expect. So one of the really gratifying things for me has just been hearing from readers, the way, what the book has meant to them beyond just a few hours of entertainment. So, yeah, thank you.
So I think we'll have time for one more question. So you can come up after this. Come on, go ahead. Go ahead.
So I confess this is a story, not a question, but it's one you want to hear. So you wouldn't know it to look at me, but I row recreation. And one of the things I have found when you travel, it's pretty easy to connect with a local club and row. I've rowed on canals in Holland. I've rowed on the Seine in Paris. I've rowed on the Rhine. One time I got to row in Genoa, Italy. And they connected me with a club and a guy to go row who didn't speak a word of English. But we somehow managed to put the boat together and go rowing. We must have rowed for 10K, and a lot of Tuscany went by, and no words were spoken. As we get back, you put the boat away, or whatever, and the guy sort of claws out. Where from? I said, Seattle. You know Seattle? He says, see, boys in boat. The brand new Travis. I thought it was wonderful. That's it. Thank you.
In the book and movie, I thought that the coxswain went through a character arc. What can you tell us about this story of the coxswain?
In the book and the movie, Yeah, so Bob Mock, I think Eric, because he is a coxswain and can probably speak to this better than I can, but Bob Mock is certainly, I think, other than Joe Ramps, the character that I became most intrigued by as a writer. And partly that's just because as a 5'7" guy, the idea of getting a boat with these enormous people and telling them what to do. Both really attractive, but also terrifying. So I just kind of like the psychology of coxswains, and as I've been going around the country and talking to rowers and coxswains, I just always feel kind of a special bond with the coxswains. I love the rowers, but I can't really identify they're like superhuman creatures. So Bob Monk was just a really, really interesting guy. He was incredibly smart. He went on to become a prominent lawyer here in Seattle. There's just no doubt about it. He was flat out super smart guy. And that's helpful to have in a boat because, as I'm sure Eric will tell you, these things unfold in a race that you don't necessarily expect, and people have to make decisions, and you have to know what the coaches want, and so on and so forth. So Bob, just because he was so, I don't know if pugnacious is the right word, but had his confident, had his chin up all the time. Always, we're gonna do this, we're gonna get through this, we're gonna win this.
Made up things.
Right,
Mind and boat.
Right, like a thief when he had to, keep the boat where he wanted it. It's just a really complex, interesting.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that the movie necessarily, he was very intellectual. Phi Beta Kappa, 3-time Shaw winner, like he was really an off the charts smart guy. And I think there's like different coxswain personalities. I had always been an athlete. I wanted to be an athlete. So I wanted to be able to relate to those guys. So I ran stairs with them. I went to the weights. I did all that stuff with them. That wasn't necessarily Bob's deal. And it doesn't necessarily make you a better coxswain or a different coxswain. I mean, it's just a different style. And his style was much more intellectual. His style was much more high. I guess what I would say about Bob Mock is he was highly competitive. And that's what you want in a coxswain.
Absolutely.
You want a guy that will go to the mat for you. And like Mary Whipple, again, back to the question about the Olympics. Mary Whipple, coxswain here at Washington, multiple NCAA champion my whole career. Then she goes to the national team, silver medalist in the 2004 Olympics, 2000, gold medalist 2008, gold medalist 2012, the most decorated rower / coxswain we have in the University of Washington. Mary Whipple's coxswain. Here's the one characteristic I tell you about Mary Whipple. She's one of the most competitive people you meet. Like if you are in one of the 8 people in that boat, you want one person, and that's Mary Whipple. Okay, she's going to get you across that line. And that was the way Bob Mock was. Bob Mock was going to get you across that line. That's what those guys loved about him. He had his quirks, man. He was on the rowing stewards. Actually, he almost crossed over on the rowing stewards. He drove the University of Washington crazy, man, because he wanted things to go the way he saw them go.
He also, interestingly, I make a point of this in the book, most of the oarsmen in that 36 boat, when they came back with their gold medals, most of them like stuck them in sock drawers and out of the way places and went out and tried to get a job to get through another year of school and stuff. Bob Mock advocated for that crew and for what they had done in 1936 for the rest of his life. I mean, he was determined that they not be forgotten. And so it was a different cut in many ways than the guys with the oars.
Yeah, okay, and I think this is a good place for us to end this, and please feel free to come up and talk to us afterwards. When I sat down with Bob Mock and first talked with him, it was the exact same experience that Dan had, which he was very much Bob Mock. He was, well, this is the way it was. He was passing out, the whole story. Which is huge. Don Hughes pulled his eyes on that. Some great quotes from Don Hughes on that. One time I saw him get emotional when he started talking about this guys. And he said, I think they're the greatest crew that ever existed. That's the advocacy that I had for them. And you know what? They might have been the greatest crew that existed. We really will never know. But I do know this, that Bob Mock was
incredibly loyal to those guys.
Yeah.
He saw every single one of them as his brothers, and he wasn't emotional over the fact that he had at that point in time had lost 4 of them. And he knew it was the end. I mean, he got to the multiple times, and he found out my mom was a minister, and he wanted to ask about, what happens, and he had a lot of questions. And, he was just such a wonderful man, but so dedicated, but also, it wasn't about the gold medal for him, it was about that team and that brotherhood, and what he got.
Yeah.
And that's what, we just think that's how, that's why Joe said to you, no, you can't.
Yeah, right, exactly, it was the same attitude, but Bob's just so much more vocal.
Yes, right, exactly. All right, well, thank you.
Thank you.